Do life's greatest questions seem like a mystery? Well, we're probably going to talk about it here at Appalachian Liturgy. Important questions like, are you a Jedi or an Imperial? Is oatmeal actually a breakfast cereal? Is a Catholic weekday really called a ferial? Did you know that Mr. Rogers was Presbyterial? So join us as we have a little fun talking about thy kingdom come. Appalachian Liturgy.
Welcome, everyone, to the Appalachian Liturgy podcast. I'm Justin Stacy.
I'm Justin Bolling.
And I'm the Reverend Brooke Atchley. And our guest tonight is my oldest daughter, Anna. So she's going to share some from her personal perspective tonight on our topic.
Welcome, Anna, back to the podcast.
Yeah,
Second appearance. returning guest. Dustin and Nate will get offended. They like their
Well, Dad told me I was the only one in the family that hadn't been on the podcast. I was like, I've been on the podcast. I just got invited back.
That's right.
Apparently, somebody's not watching all of our podcasts.
Someone's not paying attention to our podcast. That's what's going on.
Dad's in trouble.
Yeah, thanks for being on. So tonight, our topic is substance abuse, and obviously, it's a huge issue for Southwest Virginia and Northeast Tennessee. I think any area probably in America that you can that's more poverty stricken is going to have an issue with substance abuse. And I know you've had history with that. So I'm very thankful that you're comfortable enough to talk about it, publicly in this fashion. But I wanted to just toss it over to you and kind of give us your history on that.
Okay, well, I'd say I started using about a year ago, which I'm a 306 days sober today. So if it hadn't been that long, then I probably wouldn't be open to talk about it. But at this point, I think people in the recovery community are pretty wide open about it. People are starting to speak out a lot more on it, and people are starting to help a lot more people on it, especially like on TikTok. So I started sharing my story on there, and it kind of took off. But I worked a 12-step rehab program called MRT. But I was, using off and on. When I was a teenager, you just drink and party and that kind of thing, but you just start to use just to experiment. And I think, lots of teenagers do that. But teenagers, when you have a lot of trauma in your life, you start realizing that you can use it to cope. And then that kind of starts you with your addiction. And I think that's how a lot of people get sucked into it so fast. But I mean, there's all kinds of substance abuse. There's all kinds of different substance abuses. And I've noticed that it's getting a lot easier to get a hold of all kinds of different things. Personally, I've never done heroin, but heroin's getting really big right now, which is really scary. There's lots of people that are overdosing on heroin here lately. But I know the last judge that I was in front of, he said that the community here is just eating up with it right now. But yeah.
So
Wow.
What was your substance of choice?
I used methamphetamines, which is a big one out right now. That's really big. I mean, that's just as popular as, weed nowadays. It's very normal.
So I think when we talk about substance abuse in Appalachia, and you and I have talked a lot.
Mhm.
So, and we may need to tell some folks about a little bit of the history and how we got to where we're at. But we've talked a lot about how when we talk about substance abuse in Appalachia, people automatically go to opioids or pills.
Mm-hmm.
And even though I think that's an issue, the more I'm involved with the recovery community, the more I'm hearing lots of other substances other than
Yeah,
opioids.
and I think a part of it is like, they had the big oxy, boom when that was out, that kind of thing. But they've made it to where those pills aren't as easy to come about, or where they can't, they're not like where they're jail pills where you have to take them. I feel like it's more of the older generation that does that, which is kind of scary because the younger generations, it's a lot easier to get addicted to some of the harder stuff. There's less overdoses from there's more overdoses from like the pain pills and that kind of thing than there is the, uppers, whether it be, methamphetamines, cocaine. You don't really see that as much around, but people do overdose on it. But it's the downers from like the opioids or the heroin and that kind of thing that you see, a lot of people overdosing on right now.
Wow. So there's a show on Hulu called Dopesick, and it's about the opioid epidemic from the early 2000s on, and it based in Southwest Virginia, and it's an amazing show. I would suggest anyone watch it. But I mean, that's a lot of the things that they talk about is, opioid specifically. But as you said, there's harder stuff now that's popular. But opioid specifically, once you start taking it, once you start getting addicted to it, it rewires your brain to where
Yes.
now you can't do without it. Like
We were
you have to
talking
have
about
it.
that yesterday. So like with opioids too and that kind of thing, when you get dope sick, you actually have withdrawals from it. Like you are actually sick. With those kinds of things, you really have to go to a place to get off of it so they can keep you from withdrawing and dying from it. As far as like methamphetamines, you can just come right off of that. Now you're going to
Oh, wow.
sleep for a while, but and you're going to be really tired, but it's very mentally, it holds your head very mentally, because the sensors in your head that cuts off your dopamine when you're getting it lessens that, so you get more dopamine, so you truly feel when you're on it like you've never been happier than that sober. So it's very hard for people to come off of, but being in recovery is very isolating anyways. And then you have to lose all your friends, you have to move places. It's just very isolating, and then it feels very depressed, not necessarily because you're sad, but because everything that you used to do on it does not make you feel as happy as it used to when it's on it. It's very dangerous that way, and that's why people stay on it, because they just feel so depressed, so tired, so without it. And it's to the point where you can be doing so much better mentally, you can be in so much of a better place in your life, and it's such a struggle in your head every single day, because even though you're so much happier, you're in such a better place and you don't want to use, at the end of the day though, you're still going to want to use. So that's why it's so the recovery rate is very, very low for methamphetamines, and and heroin too.
When you were talking about people kind of thinking about opioids first and some stuff like that, do you think there's like a generational gap or something like that in what people expect, or the way they kind of approach recovery with things? They'll look at what was a issue 10 or 15, 20 years ago or something like that, and think that's how they need to approach every situation, and that they don't have the same understanding as what the current generation's going through.
I do. And, I just think that's in life in general, and I mean this in the nicest way, but a lot of the times the older you get, the more people are stuck in their ways anyways. But I think, the older generations and that kind of thing, they see this, they see opioids as the problem. That's probably what they continue to think. And that's probably how they continue to think that we should do things to resolve it. But honestly, I just think people need to be more educated in recovery in general, because I don't really feel like a lot of people understand the whole, concept of recovery and what people have to go through, and, the steps that you work and that kind of thing. People just think, oh, well, that person used to do drugs and they're not doing drugs anymore. They don't actually understand everything that you have to do and you have to conquer to actually be in recovery, because being in recovery is a big deal. And a lot of people still will look at that and be like, oh, well, good for you, but you shouldn't have been doing that. They don't actually see how hard it is for people to get where they need to get. And I think that's where people really need to be more educated in it, so they understand a little bit more about it.
Do you think that part of the problem is that the culture at large, it still treats drug addiction, substance abuse? I mean, you can really say any substance abuse, but specifically here, drug addiction, as a crime, because once as a culture you view someone as a criminal, does that hinder the rehabilitation and the recovery process?
I think so, just because people, once a lot of people in recovery, they have records, once you get sucked in the system, it's very hard to get out. And I think people don't see a good way out, and if they can be on the street corner selling some and making quick money, that's going to be a lot easier for them to be getting a new job. They just feel that's kind of like their safe place, as crazy as it sounds, but like they don't want, it's so much easier for them to get high, not worry about the struggles and everything that they're going to have to face, because once you're in recovery, you just feel like you're so much farther behind than everybody, and you feel like you've got so much catching up to do. And it's just the way people cope with that is by getting high, and it just sucks them right back in.
Yeah, I've always thought, and I think this is more of a knock to our justice system, honestly, and just across the board, in that you commit a crime, you have a criminal record, you serve your time, whatever the punishment was, you serve that, and then you have that record to go along with you to prevent you from prospering in our economy. It's just going to lead you right back down into a criminal path, and I think that's just across the board. So,
well, and I mean, if you put a drug addict in jail and you don't work a program, then, you're coming out, you're not mentally in the spot that you should, just because you go and you sit there and you do 5 years doesn't, I mean, some people, that's all they need. But some people, you really need to sit down and work a program, because these recovery programs aren't usually about, your substance, whatever. It's about yourself. It's a lot of soul searching. It's a lot of making amends with yourself and facing, what your trauma was, why you were using that, making amends with who you need to make amends, setting, your path straight. And if in jail, you're just sitting in big boy timeout. That's all you're doing. You're just staring at a wall. You're going to come out of there probably, super mad at the justice system, and you're not going to have as level of a head as if you worked a program and they helped you figure that stuff out.
I'm now forever referring to jail as big boy timeout. So
pretty good. That's a pretty good name for it.
That's what I call it. It's
So,
big kid timeout.
You did 90 days, right? Was it
I did
45 days in Southwest Regional for a probation violation.
Mm-hmm.
Were you using before you went in, and were you
like using before I went into jail?
Yeah.
And I went right out, and it didn't faze me any. But that's just 45 days too. That's really not much of anything. 45 days into my recovery, I was still mad. I was having to go to class every single day. I was still mad at everybody. It wasn't until 4 or 5 months under my clean belt that I was more level-headed and glad that I was doing it.
Which I do think when people are in active addiction, that sometimes being forced by the court system to go into a program can be enough of a reset, even though you were furious. I mean, I was the one taking her
I was
to class.
furious, but it's really hard for me to speak on for other people, for them to start to get clean for themselves, because when I was starting to get clean, I wasn't doing it for myself. I was doing it for my son. So, I mean, and I've had friends, that have gone into rehab. One of my really good buddies, actually, he was in rehab and he was doing it for himself. So it's really hard for me to speak on forcing other people to be in a rehab program, but they had sent him from jail and he did the rest of his time in his rehab program. So I can't personally speak on, how it would be to be forced to do it for yourself. I can only do it if forced to, do it for somebody else, and then eventually do it for yourself.
So I think,
kind of go ahead, Brooke.
I mean, professionally, I have worked with folks who are in active addiction and in active recovery. I think active recovery is a term, because I think you're always
recovery.
in recovery. But I learned a lot of what I needed to not say and what to say and what to do. And some of the things, because of this, right? And things that I might have said to other people, I now realize is probably not the best thing to say or do. And I think too, even though Anna was the one in active addiction, we were all in that, in some kind of tension with that, right? So she's the one in recovery, but we've all had to deal with stuff to assist her and support her in any way that we can. Is that fair? Like, we had to learn to communicate in different ways sometimes, and
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
so what what would you want people who haven't suffered with substance abuse, and we won't talk about addiction, let's talk about somebody who hasn't dealt with substance abuse but wants to support people in recovery, what can they do?
I mean, that's such a wide range of things, but what I will say is if you're wanting to work with people that have had substance abuse and that kind of thing, treat them like you would somebody that, you know, you see in church or anybody else. Don't be overly nice to them. Don't be, and that's just as isolating as not talking to them, honestly. You know, if you feel like people are going way out of your way to even tell you you're doing a great job, I'm really proud of you. If that's not somebody that wouldn't look at my mom and look at her every day and say, I'm proud of you, that's just as isolating, just because, you know that they're looking at you and they're still seeing, oh, she's an addict, or, oh, he's an addict. Although, you know, they're trying to be nice and they're saying, I'm proud of you, or, oh, you look good, you've put weight on. I get that all the time. Oh, you look so good. Thanks. You know, I thank you for your compliment. But that means you're still looking at me, you know, in a different way than you would look at my mom. You would never look at my mom and be like, oh, you put weight on, you look healthy. You know what I mean? And people don't mean it necessarily in a bad way, but people get that said, you know, a whole lot to them. And that's a big thing that I stress to people. And, you know, people in active addiction, they constantly feel judged for a while, you know, because they still feel like, you know, they're proven to themselves, but they're proven to everybody else. And the last thing that they want people to see them as is, oh, well, they are in recovery. You know, and I tell mom all the time, I'm just to the point sometimes that I don't want to talk about recovery. I just want people to see me as me. I don't want people just to see me as I'm in recovery. You know, I want people to see me as Anna. And so that's a big thing that I've stressed to my parents or anybody else. If you know somebody's in active addiction, or I mean in recovery, that doesn't mean, oh, okay, tell them you look great, whatever. Tell them that maybe once, I'm proud of you, but don't every time you see them or go way out of your way, you look healthy. You know, you're doing so good. I'm so proud of you. You know, just do it sparingly, I guess. You know, don't isolate them in that sort of sense.
Don't make that like the only quality that makes you type thing.
Yeah, because I mean, and people really, they don't mean it in a bad way. They, you know, they're
Right.
trying to be very good, but it's very isolating. You know what I mean? Like, it's, I wouldn't say it's backhanded, but it almost is like, oh, you've put on weight. You look so good. You look healthy.
Which
You know?
insinuates you didn't before.
You didn't otherwise. Yeah.
You know, and that's a very common thing, you know, or just going way out of your way. I'm so proud of you. I'm just so proud of you. You know, I'm glad you're proud of me. Thank you. Like, I had somebody who came up and told me, I've not heard anybody say one bad thing about you. Well, that's great. You know what I mean? They don't mean it in a bad way, but that's very isolating, you know, and that's not going to want to make people come around you. You know, if it's, like I said earlier, if it's not something you would say to Joe Smo that's not in recovery, you know, I just wouldn't say it.
Yeah, I like the way you put that too about isolating. I think it's a similar thing we talked about, you know, when people are even coming to church for the first time, like singling them out too much, you can really isolate somebody that way. And which is kind of a subject I kind of wanted to ask you about as well. And I think we had talked about, you know, mentioning was like, lots of times when you talk about substance abuse, at least, you know, in the past, like us old heads think about, you think about like the role that the church played in like the AA program being started and things like that. And I was wondering if there was anything in particular that you think that the church does well or doesn't do well when it comes to supporting people who are in recovery.
I mean, I think, you know, and to be quite frank, like a lot of the people who are in recovery are using substance abuse. This doesn't this doesn't mean everybody in poverty, but a lot of people, it's people in poverty. So, people come and they, go to your food banks, or like we do community meals. They go through the line and they pick up community meals. And I think that's a great way for them to help out. But I don't necessarily know if that's a great way to get them to come to church, because if they're coming to your church to get handouts, because they need it, they're probably not going to feel comfortable to come and sit in church with you and worship with you that Sunday, because they're not, they don't like to, ask for handouts. They're not going to want to sit where somebody served them or they needed help. You know what I guess I don't really exactly know how to phrase it, but I hope you kind of understand what I'm saying. It would be, like somebody that comes every Tuesday for food because they can't afford food. They're not dressed really nice, and then that they don't feel like they're your peers when they're coming in. They feel like you're almost their superior.
Yeah, I think that even if the person is not in recovery or active addiction, that's an issue, right? Like you can't, it's the whole ministry to and not ministry with. And it's really hard to balance that scale, I think. And I think we can do the best that we can and keep that in mind. But we have a tendency to do things for people, and because it makes us feel good, and we puff our chests out, and in doing so we diminish the self-worth of the person that's receiving whatever it is, and they're not going to come and sit with me and worship if I've made them feel terrible about having to ask for help, and even if I don't mean to make them feel bad, I have to be really careful in the way I act towards them so they feel valued and not an object of my charity.
Well, even if you don't come across that, there's a level of poverty where people do not care that they're getting handouts, but there's that also level that's very common where they don't want to have to take it, but they need it. Even if you're just doing it gracefully and you're doing it nicely and you're not making them feel bad, in the back of their head, they're not going to feel like your peers. They're going to feel like you're over them because you're having to help them. And that's, I don't necessarily think that we shouldn't do the food banks. It's very, a very thin line there where it's really hard to juggle that. But I think that's a big reason why a lot of people, don't want to come. But people in recovery, when, at least the way I feel, so like my background, I say it's very checkered. That's the way I describe it. It's spicy. I don't know a lot of people who have a spicy record that goes to church. So you just feel very out of your element, and I'm not exactly sure how we could get more people like that into a church. Now, I have noticed some of the bigger churches with like more of the contemporary and that kind of thing, it's a little bit easier, but people feel like they can slip in and slip out. So I don't really think, that's necessarily the answer. But when you have a whole bunch of what look like upper class, people coming in, and you're coming in, you got tattoos all over your arms. I mean, I've got tattoos from my shoulders down to my feet. I have a huge alien on my chest that I probably wouldn't have got if I wasn't in active addiction. And you have all these little old ladies, who don't agree with that. There's certain things that I would wear to like, so you don't necessarily see it. You know what I mean? And people just feel very isolated in that sort of sense as well.
I'm laughing about the alien because you should show them the alien.
Wow.
Okay, well, first of all, it's a cover up that my friend did a tattoo and he messed it up. It was supposed to be 3 things. Okay. A sun, a moon, and Saturn. The Saturn was great. The moon was great. The sun, no. I ended up going to jail the next day. So I had to do 45 days with it on. And when I got out, my son's father paid for another friend to do this. But it took him so long to do that. I was going to get it colored in. So that's why there's stuff all in the head, because he was covering up the other things. So it's got like my, my zodiac symbol in it, and it's got all kinds of different like spacey type things.
I was about to say, I like the space theme is continuous through all of it. That's pretty good.
That's an amazing reason to get a tattoo.
And so it was a cover up, but he took so long that we were going to do it in a second set and he was going to put the color in it, but we never got that far. So it's just like this. And Dad says it looks like a cell. That's what he tells me all the time. It looks like a mitochondria.
Mitochondria.
Yeah. Cell on my chest all the time. And Hudson tries to pick it up. He won't ever let
Wow.
me forget that it's there. He sits there like this.
So
and
do we
tries
need to
pick
get
it
a
up.
cover up of the cover up?
There's no way you can cover this big bad boy up, Mom. It's there for life.
Here's my question. How do you mess up a sun?
I don't know.
I was drawing
Look,
suns
so
at 3 years old.
Okay, so like it had a line, right? And then a line, and then a line, and then a line. But then he had an extra one, and it was like he needed to go and put a line in between each of the other ones, but it just looked off. Like there was not enough space for the lines.
Wow.
And it looked bad. Yeah, so that was Stephen paid for me to get this one done. And we didn't want the sun in the middle of the alien's head, but that's where it had to go. So that's why it's got this big thing right in the middle of its eyes. That's the cover
amazing.
of the sun.
That's
Yeah.
amazing. So if you ever do want to upgrade that tattoo, I would go ET. Like I think that's
ET?
that.
Like
Yes.
ET phone home?
Yeah, that would be amazing. That'd be a great
Oh my
tattoo.
gosh. Well, I have another tattoo on my ankle that Dad says looks like it's drawn on with crayon, and I had gotten it plucked. I got it plucked on in jail. I had my mom's initials plucked on my fingers or on my thumb right here that I got in jail, and I didn't think anything of it till I was on the phone, and Mom was like, "You got a jailhouse tat for me?" And I was
Wow,
like, "Now,
how
ever since
sweet."
she said that every single time I see it, that's what I think. You got a jailhouse tat for me? I was
That's
like,
amazing.
oh my gosh. But yeah, I let Steven try to go over the one on my ankle with the tattoo gun, and Dad was like, "It looks like it's drawn on with crayon. Looks like Hudson's done it." That's what he tells me every single time he sees it.
Okay, so we're down a rabbit trail on tattoos.
That's our first rabbit hole.
We
Okay.
are required to go down rabbit
Yeah,
trails. It's
we
not-
really
did
are.
not. We went pretty far.
Going back to the church thing that you were talking about, I think the main issue here is that when we're doing, as a church, when we're doing ministry for someone, for something, for the church,
Mm-hmm.
and we're not forming relationship with people, that's it. Like the best way to get people into church in all circumstances is relationship, period.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't think that it doesn't matter how contemporary of a church you are and how how much you can promote your church, how many people's going to your church, whatever. I don't think that matters. I think relationship is the key to getting people into church, period.
I think too, we have to quit looking at substance abuse as a moral failure. When we look at substance abuse or substance use as a moral failure, we are casting judgment on something that we don't understand, first of all. But the reality is we all have addictive personalities and we're all addicted to something, right? I mean, we've talked about this. I just happen to have never picked up an addictive substance, an illegal substance, right?
Mm-hmm.
You take my coffee away from me and I'm going to kill somebody.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't function.
Literally.
I don't function well. I mean, I drink coffee all day long. I mean, I am a caffeine addict. It just happens to be a legal substance, right?
I think it's important as a church that we stop looking at things, the legality of it, and automatically assuming that's immoral, because it's not the same thing.
Well, one of the things that we learn, working our 12 steps is that there's always going to be that void there. You just have to find something that's healthy and a way to cope with it and something to fill that void, whether it be, and they call it healthy coping mechanisms. So, I mean, everybody's got their own. Nobody's is going to be the same. Some people listen to music. Some people go outside. I will go and hang out with Hudson because Hudson will ground to me really quick, whatever it may be. But Mom's healthy coping mechanism is going and getting a coffee if she needs it, and it just so happens that it's legal. And
Right.
So I think too, you hinted about AA, which is where that concept of 12 steps came from, right? So any 12-step program that you do, no matter what it's called, is kind of based on the same 12 steps. They look a little different, they sound a little different. Different programs use different things. There is a wonderful book called The 12 Steps for Christians. And if anybody who follows Christ is really interested in and not in addiction or not in recovery, they need to pick this book up. And from my experience, because I've done a lot of continuing ed way before we had this issue in our family that we were dealing with. And it was eye-opening to me, because what it shows us is the things that she's talking about, the voids, the trauma, the things that we're addicted to. It helps us look at that in a way that we don't normally do that. I can remember going on this intensive continuing ed conference trip on addiction and recovery. And this was many years ago. I went out west to one of the first drug courts and sat through that for a couple of days, met with people who were in recovery, met with people who were incarcerated for some really serious stuff. And it was people who had murdered or whatever while high or, whatever. And one of the ladies sitting across the table, she's in her handcuffs and shackles, and we're eating lunch together, right? Like, yeah, prison trays, great stuff. And she looks at me and she says, "You have zero business talking to anybody about recovery. You have zero business running a recovery program. You have zero business supporting this. You need just to walk away." And I looked at her and I said, "Why the heck?" And she said, "You're too nice." She said, "You need to learn how to tell the truth and don't sugarcoat it." She said, and what I've learned in the years past is that if you want to be an authentic community, you go sit with somebody in a recovery meeting, because they're going to shoot it to you straight. You may not like it. You may not like and we're not used to that.
Well, and so, when you're sitting around in your circle and you're talking and someone's feeling bad about something that they've done, people will almost, "Oh yeah, well, I can top that," and will literally talk bad about, whatever they've done. And then somebody will top that, and, no shame, no guilt. But what I'll say back about the 12 steps of Christian, the program that I worked, all three of you all could crack that book open and work it from first page and back page. It's really not about substance abuse.
Right.
None of it is about substance abuse. It's about yourself. That's, there's not one thing where you literally talk about just, "Oh, how has your substance abuse done this in your life?" It's not that at all.
Well, and any 12-step program is really not about the substance abuse. It is about you and your brokenness and whatever traumas you have endured and done, to other folks. So I think everybody should go through that book, and it's 12 steps for Christians, and they've done it that way. So those of us who are sitting in the pews of the church will give it a chance. But when you compare those 12 steps for Christians right alongside the 12 steps for AA or NA or whatever, they're the same.
Well, the book that I'm doing, I think it's titled "How to Escape Your Own Prison." And honestly, I think if people are avidly wanting to work with people in recovery, I think they ought to work that themselves, just because you will, even you not have been having a substance abuse problem, will find out a lot about yourself. But what I will say is that it's not an easy book to read, or it's not an easy book to work through, because you will uncover things that you didn't even know you had problems with at the time.
I think one of the steps that you were working through that you and I talked about, because we don't talk about all the steps. I mean, this is your recovery, and what Anna shares with me, she shares, and I try really hard not to ask questions, but I still do, and I really want to. And I think it's important for those of us who are family members of people who are in recovery and they're working these steps, is to to guard ourselves a bit against being too prying. This is her thing and she needs to do that. And what she wants to share with me is fine. That doesn't mean I don't want to know, but I know enough not to ask, or at least I try not
And
to.
one thing I've noticed too with people in recovery is when they want to share, they will. A lot of people in early recovery, they don't usually share. I found right now, and I'm very thankful for this, that people are speaking more and more out about it. Like I've seen a lot of stuff on social media about people in recovery. More and more and more people are recovering out loud, and that's very rare. But I think it's a good move for people, to start helping people, go through their recovery. But I think, up until just this past year, I really didn't know very many people were in recovery. And now, there's a very large recovery community, and I've known people are being a lot more open about it. But the recovery community in of itself is one of the least judgmental people, some of the most accepting people. You could have done the worst of the worst, and these people are going to, almost try to top it just to make you feel like you're all right. Like you've got this, like you think that's bad. I've done this. So just keep going. You see how far I've gotten. So I feel like Christians in general almost need to be like that.
I agree. Well,
And that's really funny. Oh,
go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say that's really funny that you said that, because all this is like really interesting information to me. That's stuff that I haven't really thought about explicitly, and I have a theory I wanted to run by you all and see. You can shoot it down. Maybe I'm totally wrong because I've observed it from afar. So I'm a big boy. I can take it. But
you'll be putting big boy timeout.
Big boy, yeah. But my theory on what I was trying to think what I think the church probably does well on stuff like this and what they probably can improve on. And I feel like the church is great, and they love a good conversion story when it's over, type thing, or when it's reached a point to where you can say what I have overcome. And so, like when you can say like you mentioned, I've been a year since I've abused a substance or something. I think the church is great about accepting you back in, and letting you join the community and not looking on your past as if that defines you at that point. I feel like what the church struggles with, though, a lot is when we're going through it, just starting something and trying to get over it. We kind of want to, and not to sound like, I have a hammer, so everything looks like a nail type thing, but we want the salvation process to be instantaneous and not a process per se, to where it's something that you're working at and growing at slowly, and it's not something that happens overnight. So I think when we're in that weird in-between phase where we're already uncomfortable, a lot of stuff can kind of stack. And as a church, we're uncomfortable with the fact that somebody is really struggling with this and want to work and working through it right now, and not totally, like able to say, I've beat this. And I know that's not really the right verbiage to use on something like that anyway, but does that make any sense, or am I totally off base on that? It's okay to say I am too.
No, that makes sense. I mean, and just like here recently, like I've been talking to my son's mom, and she's talking about how mature I am for my age. And, I've just been talking to her about her son. And I'm like, this is the way he sees things. She's like, you've opened my eyes on a lot of things. And I'm like, well, Jennifer, you've got to think that I have this many days of sober under my belt now. The way I see things, the way I process things, the way I talk about things, I've either learned or, I have come to realize this. And that's the only reason why I can talk to you about it. When I'd started that's not how I would have talked. I wouldn't have been able to explain that. I wouldn't have been able to put that in words. So people I would say are a lot more accepting and a lot more trusting of me now, and, see me as more of a peer now than they would have at the beginning. But at the beginning, you really need more support. The most support is at the beginning, because you just already feel very isolated.
Well, and I think too, correct me if I'm wrong, when you are first going into recovery, you're angry at the world, or at least it seems that way,
at yourself, at just everything.
Everything makes you mad, but you have to leave everything that
old places, old friends, old things will take you out every single time. That's 90% of the reason why people relapse are old friends and old places. You have to totally uproot your whole life. You will never see me live back in Honaker again. You will never see me, stay there. Now at this point, I think I could be there for a day, but you will never see me. I don't hardly talk to anybody. I talk to my son's father, and I talk to maybe 2 other people out of my whole group. I used to feel like I have all these friends. I was with people all the time, these people that I spent a whole bunch of time with that I just don't speak to anymore. I don't communicate with anymore. And you feel very lonely, and you feel like you're almost, in high school again, where you're having to figure out who your real friends are, who you can be around, who you can trust. And it's terrible. It's not fun, and it's very isolating, and it's very dark. And then you're already in such a mental battle with yourself as well. So it's very it's very depressing. It's very dark. It's not a good place to be in at the beginning. And that's when you really need, people to feel like they're standing behind you the most.
And I'll speak from the perspective of somebody who was there day in and day out during that period of time. It is hard. It is hard on that person too, because they're not so nice, right? I mean, honestly, when they lash out, they're hurting so much that they are just trying to hurt whoever is around them. And so it is like, I used to not be able to understand when people would say, I just can't do this anymore. I know this person is trying, but they have to leave my house. There were days that I thought, I can't do this. I can't have her treat me like this in my house one more day. She is going to have to either get it together or go. And I needed an outlet to be able to express that and have people say to me, yes, you can do this. Like she's not meaning this to you. She's not doing this to you. And so for me, the church provided me the support and reminded me that I could do this, that I could take whatever she needed to lash out so that she could move on. Right.
Well, and a lot of the times, like we talk about it a lot in our groups and that kind of thing. And I've been I have a friend that's TikTok famous for his recovery page, and me and him text back and forth, but we were talking about it the other day. Why, a lot of the reasons why people start using is because of trauma, like we were talking about earlier. But little do people know, the trauma that their addiction is going to cause them once they get into it. So when you're getting out of it, you're not only dealing with the trauma that you didn't want to use before, but you're dealing with all the trauma that you've caused during your addiction. And depending on how long, you've been in that addiction, the more trauma that you've been trying to escape and escape and escape. So it's, overwhelming bits of emotion that a lot of the times you don't even know how to process because you've avoided it for so long.
I thought of something earlier that I thought was really important to share, and now I've forgotten. But when I was talking about the steps, when you were working some of the steps and you were talking about some of the steps, the one that sticks out that I have thought of over and over again, I mean, there were the steps where you had to think about, your future 90 days or whatever. But I think the one that stuck out to me the most was the step where you had to identify who you were lying to and what you were lying about.
It wasn't just lying. I mean, they had 1 through 15, and it had all kinds of different things. And you had to list, important relationships that you had in your life. And there was things down that list that were options like, are you leading them wrong? Are they leading you wrong? Do you let them have a negative influence in your life? Do you yell? Do you, do you trust them? Do they trust you? And you wrote down that. And then the next column was, what you needed to do to fix that was like the next one. And it was amending things. But the big one that sticks out in my head over my steps was they had, it's the first one, and it's a pyramid, and it's split down the middle, and it goes like 1 year, or like current, 1 year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. So, I mean, for me, I had to alter, fix that a little bit to how I could do it. Cause I'm just 22 years old. So 20 years ago, I was 2, but you do.
Thank you for that math lesson.
So, but you have one side of your current life and you have to draw in pictures, what your current life is. And then you have to do what your life could have been. And on those two sides, you say, well, this is what happened. And then on your second one, you'd say, well, then you pretty much, when you're talking to the class, this happened and I did that because of this. And then this happened. And because of that, this happened. And then on the other side, you're like, well, I could have done this instead. And I could have done this instead. And that would have ended up here, instead of here. And that one's a really hard one for people to pass. Like people have to redo that step quite often. I can't remember. I was like the first one out of, I think, 15 that had gotten it done on the first time. And I talked to my teacher for 15 minutes about it to be able to pass it.
So let's talk about passing and failing. So in Anna's MRT program, her peers would vote on whether or not she passed a step.
Well, the leader of the group, so like the teacher of the group, she can straight up tell you, I want you to redo it. But if it passes her standards, you leave the room and then your peers can, pass you. And then when you come back, they give you feedback, or they tell you a lot of the times, they'll be like, oh, you did really well. I can tell you put a lot of thought in it. I'm really proud of you, whatever. But you can't pass or fail somebody if you haven't already passed that step.
But they can be pretty hard on you too. If they feel like you just BS'd your way through it, they call you on it.
Well, I mean, and most of the time the teacher of the class will straight tell you, I don't, you need to redo that. Because they talk about it. You have to present most of your steps. There are some that you turn in, but you have to stand up in front of the class and you have to say, this is what I did. This is what I mean. This is what happened. And then people can decide from there on if they think that you need to rework that step or not. But yeah, there has been a few people that we've sent back and said, I think you need to do more. I think you need to do more work on that because you're still trying to justify your actions. Or you're making excuses, and we think that you need to go back and relook at that and reassess.
I find it interesting. A lot of the things that you've talked about with that you think is good about the recovery programs, one being that you all can confess to each other, right? And then the other being what you just described, you say pass or fail. A lot of this seems like what the church could be doing if we were Catholic, because there's a confession system.
Well, but it's what the church is supposed to be doing anyway.
Yes.
So what I love about hanging out with people in recovery, like when Anna's friends come over that have been in her programs and stuff, what I love about the joy is authentic, right? When they're hooting and hollering and laughing, it's pretty authentic, but they're also real with one another. I mean, they're not putting on airs. They either like me or they don't like me. And I know that.
Well, and something that I think that the church could honestly take a page out of our book would be, so when you first come, and you're there. So like I'm 12 stepper, right? I've passed everything. I've been there for a long time. I've known girls that have left that these other girls don't. I know the teachers really well, whatever. They all know my son, yada, yada, yada. There's girls that come, they're quiet, they don't hardly talk. But next thing you know, they'll be the 12 steppers and they're talking. So when they sit in there for longer and one of my really good friends asked them, let me tell you, we can just talk that class away. And I used to not be like that. And because me and her will sit there and we will talk about what we've been through, other people will then, those people that were quiet and they're sitting in there, they'll start working up their steps because they're willing to talk to everybody. They're willing to confess what they did. They're willing to stand up and talk about their problems, what they've done. And I think people in a church could really take a page out of that a little bit, because if people were more upfront and honest about their hardships, their sins, their problems in their life, people won't feel as sheltered. Because if more people start talking out about it, other people are more likely to start talking about it. Just like in recovery, all this people are recovering out loud. Next thing you know, there's so many more people that are recovering out loud, and the platform's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It's because people don't feel so isolated.
It's like the difference between fake community and like the true community that people strive for in those small groups, and to where you're not saying what you think people want to hear, but you're saying the truth of the matter. And you're talking about these communities growing, and so I have to ask, because I'm an old person who gets grouchy about new things, and you talked a couple times about a community and growing on TikTok. Is there something specific about TikTok that you think makes it easier or better for sharing things like this?
Sorry, folks. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have this week. Make sure to tune in next week for the second part of our discussion with Brooke's daughter, Anna. Also, if you haven't already subscribed to our YouTube channel, please do so. Follow us on all the social medias and check out our website, AppalachianLiturgy.com. Oh, and did I mention that we have t-shirts now? Because we have t-shirts now. See you next week, everyone. Appalachian Liturgy Podcast is a JR Studios production.